All right. Good afternoon slash evening, everybody. Um, Man, I just lost my words. See, I already did like a whole introduction section, and I realized that I was hit the record button, but Man, not the. I just lost my words. See, I already did like a whole introduction. Now it's all going sideways. And I realized that I was hit the record button, but Man, not the. I just lost my words. See, I already did. Okay, well let's I tell you what, it's been one of those days, I guess. So anyway, um, I'm easily amused. So today we're going to talk about language. Some quick announcements. Please do not forget your assignment that is due tonight. That would be the 3 slides. It is kind of stormy out tonight, so make sure you get that in before the deadline. I do see that many of you have turned it in. Several of you turned it in yesterday, and a few before that, and I'm guessing the rest was going to come tonight. The other announcement is that your informative speech grades, or rather, I watched all the informative speeches, graded them. I also did the right or wrong check on your outline slash works cited pages. Remember that was part of the assignment as well. That's partly why it took a long time. I didn't just watch your speeches and give you a rating, but I had to grade your outlines for right or wrong in terms of formatting, like APA style and all that. So in any case, that is great. That grading is done. I will sit on the grades for probably just one more night because I want to make sure that I didn't give someone a -5 when I gave someone else like a -8 for the same mistake, or rather the vice versa. Rather, I always try to go lighter if I can. But anyway, I will reveal the grades rather tomorrow, probably around afternoonish, and that way you can see them. There are a few people whose speeches I could not find, and I did try to contact the person or persons involved. I did not receive a reply from said persons. However, it is possible that you're still keeping up with the course, and maybe you just maybe the email system ate my note to you. In which case, if you can just get me a video file or a link, especially have a timestamp that says that you would turn it in on time, I'll be more than happy to give you a grade at full credit, assuming that's the situation. So yes, if you wake up, if not wake up tomorrow, but if you check tomorrow and realize that your grade is a 0, because you'll either have a grade or a 0, but certainly by this time tomorrow afternoon, then you need to contact me as soon as possible. Welcome to the 3 viewers I've got. Hopefully you were not too confused by the Streamception opener there. Anyway, today we're going to cover 2 subjects, really. Language, in which we'll kind of just go through really quick. It's nothing, I don't think it's really anything that's that complicated or any advice that's too earth-shattering. It's probably a lot of stuff you've heard before, to be honest with you. And then the next part, we'll talk about the survey I would like for you to do for this coming speech, for your persuasive speech. And then there's a survey that you need to actually take. And I'll write that out on our Word document and post that up later as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the content. Of course, if you have any questions before I begin or as I'm talking, go ahead and write them down in the chat, and I'll respond to them as soon as possible. I would also like to note that there is a storm outside right now. If the video just goes down, and especially if it goes down for like more than 15 to 20 minutes, it is likely that I won't be back because the power is out or something like that. So what that would mean is that we'll just pick up the broadcast probably tomorrow as I get into the office and there's a slightly more secure connection in terms of being resilient to storms. In any case, let's go ahead and go with our PowerPoint and our advice for this week, which is about language and wording your ideas. So there's some academic stuff I think we need to explain about language first before we get into any practical advice. And because the practical advice actually kind of relies a lot on understanding what language is. And the first kind of concept we've got to kind come to understand about languages is that really language is a system of symbols. Um, it's not direct thought. A lot of people get the idea that words that come out of your mouth and words and ideas that pop into people's brains when they hear those words is a one-to-one relationship, but it's not. Language is a system of symbols. And these sounds that are coming out of my mouth, or these squiggles on the screen here, are just an intermediary between me and you. So what exactly is symbolic in language? Well, there's a couple of things, actually. The first part is phonology, which is the proper name for the study of language sounds, or the sounds that words make, and also syntax, grammar structure, and seeing how messages are put together. Or rather, the next part is syntax and grammar structure, and which is grammar structure and seeing how messages are put together. See, my syntax is terrible there and probably very confusing. But syntax is the grammatical structure, okay, and semantics is the meanings of words and symbols. Sometimes you'll find people talk about that they don't want to get bogged down in semantics, which what they're really describing is that I really don't want to get bogged down in describing to you what I mean by the word sad and what you mean by the word sad, or what the definition of is. Unfortunately, though, semantics is a critical part of language and understanding each other, and that's often why, like, semantics, for example, would help us understand. If you've been to the doctor's office, you'll probably see a chart somewhere in there that says, how much do you hurt? And it'll have like a scale of 1 to 10, and the different numbers on the scale will have certain ranges. So, for example, 1 might be, slightly annoying pain, and the 10 would be, this is the worst pain I felt in my life, and maybe other reference points in between. And that's because when you go to the doctor and say, man, my throat hurts, and that's because they don't necessarily mean it's like is your throat like just a little bit scratchy and it's kind of obnoxious before you go to sleep, or is this like a critical thing where you really feel like you're going to pass out from the pain in your throat. So you've got to have those kind of semantic type discussions or semantic references if you're going to help people understand each other. And of course, then there's pragmatics, which is a study of language that is often overlooked, but it's the study of how language is often used, usually by native speakers. So this would include things like, slang, and also the kind of grammatical rules that are not really followed. Like, for example, if there's an unknown person or thing of unknown gender, you're supposed to use the he pronoun in English language. Well, pragmatically speaking, that has now changed in terms of how native speakers use it. We usually use the pronoun they, even though that is not how it is written in formal grammatical books. But nonetheless, pragmatically speaking, if you don't know something like gender, you would use a pronoun they, even though that's a plural. It doesn't make any sense, but that's how the language is used. So there's other characteristics of language as well. There's symbolism, which is the idea that words symbolize individual thoughts, and also don't forget gestures and facial expressions and punctuation as well. Okay, I see that there's a comment here that says I can't get the video to play and I've refreshed with no luck. I'm not sure what to do about that. It's going on my little preview, on the website preview. It looks like it's going. The time's elapsing. Well, let's hope that maybe they have figured it out. Abstraction, as well, as that. There's abstraction is part of language, or is a critical part of language, and that's the idea that thoughts are abstract. We try to use or appeal to common experiences to represent things that are really unknowable. Kind of similar to my pain example from just a few moments ago with the chart at the doctor's office. The word sad versus the word morose. Someone has a very high tolerance for emotional stress and might not ever describe themselves as being particularly morose or extremely depressed. Whereas somebody who maybe doesn't have a lot of tolerance for unpleasant feelings, might say they're morose at getting their balloon popped, at the at the state fair or something, and it's difficult to try to describe where exactly the line in the sand is between using the word sad and using a more strong word like morose. That line in the sand is going to be different for different people, and that's kind of the abstractness of it. And perception is how one views the context of certain information can create new meanings. So a lot of times, this can also be maybe renamed context as well. Sometimes words and meanings have a different context when you use them. For example, it's usually not a good idea these days to be flying the Confederate flag outside your home or proudly or display it on your vehicle. We can have a debate about whether or not that's something that can be done at another time, but it seems like it's not accepted very well. However, if you were to have the Confederate flag flying prominently at a Civil War reenactment, people aren't going to have a problem with it being there. And the reason why is because the context of certain information, in this case, the context of where the flag is displayed, gives a different perception of the people who are doing the thing. It's there's a big difference between displaying it at an event, maybe at a bandstand at an event for the Civil War reenactment, whereas flying that very same flag outside in your lawn is going to lead to a very different perception based on the context. So a lot of people, I think, kind of understand that. So, but another thing about perception is also with actual word choice. All right, and this is probably what you're more interested in terms of speaking. So let's go ahead and look at this example here. A doctoral student received the following message from the university. And here are some things to know about the context. This person had been at this university for several years. He was only taking 6 credits this particular semester. And this is how that letter starts. It says, "As a new graduate student, I am sure you are not aware of all the rules and regulation of the graduate school at this university. Rest assured we can bring you up to speed. All doctoral students are required to take 15 credit hours in 2 consecutive semesters. This is called residency. If you do not complete your residency, you will not be eligible for candidacy," which is what they call people who are about to graduate. So the perception here, I see that I'm losing viewer count here, so I might be on my own here. So rather than ask the question and have some dead air here, let's go ahead and just I'll talk about it. So with this example here, it would seem that the person writing the letter does not have this information over here. So the perception of this letter is going to be very different to this particular student, because this particular student seems to have been here for a long time, and it automatically assumes that they're a new graduate student because they seem to think that there's some kind of mistake in their 6 credit hours, and they're telling them, no, you need to take more. So the person who wrote this letter might feel that they're being helpful because they would be saying they don't know this information, and they're like, well, I can see why you would want to take a few hours, but you should probably take a whole lot more so that you can make sure that you graduate. But this person maybe had received this letter in error and had been at this university and has passed their residency or whatever. And they look at this as, they're like, a new graduate student? Are you crazy? I've already been here for years. So already that person reading the letter is probably going to have a more hostile interpretation of this letter, even though someone who is maybe a genuinely new graduate student might find these same choice of words to be very helpful. If that person was a new person, and they'd be like, as a new graduate student, I'm sure you're not aware of all the rules, and you're like, yeah, I'm probably not. Instead, the person who has really received this letter is probably thinking that this is maybe at best, that it seems to be some kind of a form letter sent to people with less than 15 credit hours. And at worst, it might be like they feel like they're being lectured or chastised, which they may not like, considering that they have been around for so long. So it's something to consider when you create any kind of document or any kind of speaking opportunity, that you consider how your words might be perceived based on the background information you have about your audience. And that's one reason why we do surveys. That's kind of what this is boiling down to, is that the person who wrote this letter didn't do their due diligence and tried to figure out this particular student's situation. They probably meant this in a friendly way, but because of this information here, it can be taken as actually a kind of hostile or chastisement type letter. So anyway, and this kind of brings us to a good segue to different kinds of meanings, I guess, we attach to words. That's connotation and denotation. We hear a lot about connotation these days, but not a lot about denotation. And one of the reasons why is that denotation is the dictionary definition or basic meaning of the word. The denotation is what you would find described to you in an actual reference dictionary. And then the connotation of the word is probably not going to be explained in a dictionary. You'll probably have to go to some other resource, or at least hope that you have a very, very good dictionary, to explain to you the connotation of the word. And the connotation is kind of like the emotional reaction, or maybe the attitude, or some kind of underlying, understood meaning that kind of goes along with the literal meaning, or denotation. And so every word has a denotation and a connotation. So, for example, the difference between smell and stench. The word smell might have the definition of an unpleasant odor. And the word stench, when you go to look it up in the slightly different, and later in the S's, it might also say an unpleasant odor. But any native speaker of English would tell you that there's a big difference between something like, oh, what's that smell? And, oh, what's that stench? Right? There's a big difference in attitude between those two words, because the reality is there's an understood meaning that a stench is way worse than some kind of a smell. So it's important that you kind of match the connotation with the situation that you want, and that you not choose words that the understood meanings or the emotional attachment seems inappropriate for the situation. There's a big difference between, a party and a celebration, for example. But they're both happy occasions. They both seem to involve lots of people. That's kind of the denotation of both of them. But a celebration kind of has a more emotional positivity and upwelling involved with it than simply having a party. A graduation party versus a graduation celebration kind of has, again, a different connotation, because there's a stronger emotional reaction or understood meaning about one word versus the other. So effective language kind of follows some rules, and I'm sure that we've had some of these parts, but one part of using language effectively is appropriateness. And this is sometimes, this is actually something that someone said to me. And appropriateness involves using your knowledge of the situation, of the context, to choose words and expressions that fit the emotional mood of the area, or the emotional mood of the event, or simply to choose words that you feel that the other speaker would know or respond well to. So something like, I had someone say, "Sup, Mr. P Dog, we doing anything at lecture?" There's a lot of things wrong with this one in terms of language choice. For one thing, we doing anything at lecture. What am I supposed to say? No, I saw that you didn't want to be there, and I decided we were just going to sit around all day. But that's neither here nor there. So I find the question itself offensive. But in terms of the appropriateness of the language, as a college instructor, there is a certain kind of decorum that you expect in. You would expect to be greeted with maybe full words, like instead of sup, at least give me a what's up, right? And so things like that. Now, I'm not really, one of the reasons why I think the student said this to me was because, one, we had just had a different talk about effective language use, one without this example, but The other reason why is because people are kind of comfortable with me, so they kind of talk like I guess like they would to a different kind of person. But unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that certain people that have different relationships in our lives kind of demand. The demand may not be very strong, but the situation, I suppose we could say, demands that there's a certain formality in things. For example, I still call my thesis advisor Dr. Brooks. I don't think I'll, and she's like, please call me my first name, and I can't do it because I had been that person's student for so long. I just can't get it into my brain that to call them by the first name like I would call the person that I grew up with and tell fart jokes to. I just can't I can't put them on the same level because it just seems inappropriate to me. Um, so one of the things you need to ask yourself is when you look at the words that you've chosen, you need to ask and think about the connotation, think about the emotional impact of the words. Because sup right here, I don't have anything about. I'm not even going to talk about dropping endings. That's part of the pragmatics of speech in Indiana. But like for example, sup is really something you say to somebody that is very familiar to you. And even though we can feel chummy and buddy buddy, I am not the same kind of person that your friend that rode the bus to school with you every day for 15 years is going to be. I'm not that familiar with you. So is that kind of a word appropriate for addressing me? And no, it isn't, because we're not that close. It's a hard lesson, I guess, but that's how it is. So you want to be looking at the connotation, the emotional reaction, and ask yourself, is it really appropriate for me to greet this person this way? Or is it really appropriate for me to use this particular word if someone's going to be sensitive about this situation? So, for example, the next one's kind of related in the idea of bias. Sometimes connotations can be abused to create biased language. And one of these things is, and you can disagree with me. College is a open marketplace of ideas, but then when it comes to talking about something like the abortion debate, both sides are very invested in their standpoints. For example, there's a difference in connotation between using the phrasing aborting a pregnancy, because that sounds like, well, you're stopping a process, versus something like killing unborn children, which, people would killing children is just the tabooest of taboos when it comes to that particular thing that humans are forbidden to do. So, there's a huge difference in connotation there. And of course, each side uses the words that have the connotations that they feel best supports their side, as opposed to the connotation that maybe will provide the best discussion of the phenomenon. At least that's my criticism of something like the abortion debate, is that both sides are so invested that one side goes out of their way to use words that when I say one side, I mean both sides do this. They use words that will really try to either villainize or demonize, rather, one side, and then they choose words that will try to humanize their side. And there's all kinds of examples in that particular debate. But these two phrases here are things that I hear a lot about. And really, neither of them captures neither of them really captures what would lead to a fruitful discussion by both parties. It's pretty clear that by using these terms, they're not really trying to meet each other in the middle. They're trying to really just kind of represent their side. And in a public discourse, that's not very helpful. But we'll talk, if you want to take my debate class, we talk about public discourse a lot. But anyway, so you can use language, and you don't want to use language to abuse it, right? You want to make sure that your language is, again, appropriate for the situation, appropriate for someone to use in your position, but also that it's kind of free of bias. All right, you want to say things that acknowledge maybe problems with your position that other people have, but you also want to use language that doesn't inflame others as well, right? You want to make sure that you're kind of on an even keel. You want to represent the emotional situation well, but you also don't want to try to deliberately choose language or words that inflame other people. So, for example, especially this one right here is used to inflame opinions, and that kind of shuts down discussion. But this one here is maybe not inflammatory, but it also attempts to rob the other side of sounding like they're being rational, because this sounds like it's nothing that even involves human beings. It's just stopping a process. So who cares? It doesn't necessarily involve. Neither of these are very good expressions. So anyway, grammar and word choice. So let's go ahead and watch a quick video. And what I hope this will demonstrate is how grammar and word choice can affect the perception of your language. All right, so let's go ahead and check this out, if the clicking went correctly. Yeah, I'm okay with going to that website that I know and trust.
Come on, guys. Get your heads in the game. Dear Strongman. Never get tired of how that sounds. Right now, I'm putting off writing a paper for my English class. Can you write my English paper for me? I don't even care if it's good or not. I just don't want to do it. Kyle Smith, Manhattan, Kansas. I don't really think you need to worry about it being any good if you write it, Kyle. But I'll take a crack at it. So let's start out with the title page. A well-thought-out English paper by Kyle Smith. It couldn't hurt to soup up your name a little bit, Kyle. Like throw a cool nickname in there, like Kyle, the Yellow Dart, Smith. Oh yeah, that right there will get you 5 to 10 extra credit points easy. So then you move into the introduction. Chances are, this is all your teacher's gonna read before they give you a grade, so that's why the cool nickname is so important. The Yellow Dart. I'm awesome. Then you got the body, which is my personal favorite.
Hey, Strongman, I'm in Dino House.
Oh, that sucks. What can I do for you?
Can I have the rest of this breakfast burrito?
I guess. What do you want it for?
I'm gonna try and sell it in some type of online auction.
Hey, do what you gotta do. Look, I'm busy writing a paper for my man, the Yellow Dart, over here.
Okay, bye.
You won't get more than $3.50 for it. Believe me, I've tried. Okay, so I think we're just about done. We just need to apply a little double space action, or maybe a little triple space action. Then I'd beef it up with some random diagrams. That can't hurt. I think it's pretty good as is, but couldn't hurt to throw a little cash in there to seal the deal. All right, the Yellow Dart, you owe me, man. Can nobody say Strongman never did nothing for the peoples? Now it is my intention to sit down and play video games for several hours.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. One of the things that I think makes that cartoon so humorous is because we see people do stuff like that all the time. So, for example, usually at this time I would try to talk about maybe some seeing spelling mistakes in your professor's slides, for example, like sometimes right here, and how that might impact your perception of how prepared that professor is for class. And then imagine, if you will, if you got 20 mistakes like this in one paper times 20 papers, you might have your perception of students, or I guess students as a group, but also a student as an individual, could change rapidly because a well thought out English paper doesn't seem like so like the first phrase they type and there's a mistake in it, and so it doesn't seem like maybe they had actually thought it out very well. And you also see all the time, even in business, you'll see people with, or at least I can see people with, that do the spacing. They need the report to be so many pages, but their choice of language is so direct, and honestly, it's probably okay that it's, 20 pages instead of 25, but they resort to tricks like trying to get an imperceptible but still actually fairly noticeable margin change or spacing change that will take up that extra space on the page so they can have a 25-page paper or 25-page report. And I'm sure maybe, and I'm not, this sounds patronizing, but I'm sure that many of us have also, I considered doing things like that too when I was in school just to save some time. But in any case, when you do things like that, it does definitely affect the perception of your words as well. And so you want to make sure that your grammar and word choice are, again, your word choice is appropriate and avoids bias, but more importantly, that your grammar is correct. And that's why one of my philosophies in speech writing class or in this particular class is, I'm not really looking for how many main points you have. I'm really just looking at whether or not your main points are appropriate and are worth saying. If your speech only has 2 main points versus someone else's 5, you still have the same chance of getting the A, provided you avoid the mistakes on the rubric. Or rather that you do the things that the rubric tells you to do and avoid the things the rubric tells you not to do. And as long as, I guess, there's, it's within a reasonable time period. And in fact, the time periods in the class aren't really like, they're meant as more of a guide to help you figure out, how much information you need to effectively say something, as opposed to, here's a time, let's fill it up. But anyway, you want to make sure that your grammar is good, and as long as your grammar is good, as long as you do grammar well, right? Then hopefully, hopefully people will have a good impression of your paper. Still can't get it. Okay, that's understandable. Yep, we got the storms going on over there too, and over here too. Alright, just telling that person to stay safe tonight. Alright, so the next part we want to look at are things that kind of can increase clarity. And I am kind of aware of our time here. This has turned out not to be short at all. I went too ranty. But anyway, let's go ahead and wrap this up. So simplicity. GRE words are not necessary, but you do need enough of a word to convey an image of the intended meaning. So you've got to, again, straddle the line between ambiguity and terrible preciseness. Good things are kind of actually in between, where people have room to interpret things, but also at the same time, it's pretty definite what you mean. And this is difficult to do, but this is kind of the nature of simplicity when it comes to word choice. Using words with many letters in them doesn't necessarily mean that you're speaking clearer, even though the denotation might be very elaborate. The chances of an ordinary native speaker of English even knowing a large vocabulary of words with like 10 or more letters in them, like phonology, is very slim. The more letters in a word, the less likely it is people will know it. Or rather, the more syllables in the word, less likely people are to know it, simply because that's not the pragmatic way that our language works. So you want to try to straddle that zone between having the perfect word, but is very specific in its use, so specific that it's possible that people can go their whole lives without learning it, but also it kind of captures what you really mean. So you've got to kind of straddle that area, and I know it's difficult to do, but you want to strive for simplicity and directness. Maybe another word for this would be directness, if you want to write that in your notes. Is that you want your words to be direct. You also want them to have a good denotation and connotation that's elaborate enough for you to capture your full meaning, but at the same time, you really don't want to be looking through the dictionary yourself, looking for new words. Generally speaking, you should be choosing words that you yourself know and use on a fairly regular basis, because that's going to be a great way for you to figure out if your audience knows those words as well. Next, accuracy. And of course, you want to align all of these different ideas and studies into something that accurately reflects what you mean. Um, and this is a good example here. They sometimes use language in a way that is technically incorrect, but they're understood meaning anyways, or they're understood anyways. Um, so this is a good example of how we're not really supposed to use the word they as a pronoun because it's plural, and unless you're really referring to a plurality, can't really use it. But nonetheless, we use it all the time. Um, and then we have another form of there. Um, Instead of they are, right? But nonetheless, through context, we just figure out what it is. And then, of course, anyways, which is probably the biggest one that people will make a mistake on, is there's only the word anyway. It's never plural. But nonetheless, people say anyways, and we understand what they mean. Um, you want to try to make everything as grammatically correct as possible, but at the same time, if that starts interfering with the pragmatics, and I think I ranted about this earlier, um, go ahead and do the pragmatic thing as opposed to maybe the hyper technically correct one. Um, you should really try to be technically correct while giving a public speech, though. Um, as close as possible. Only in the situation where you can say to yourself, or argue to yourself, or argue to me, rather, that using this word or using this idea, like, for example, the word they as a pronoun to refer to a singular person, um, is probably appropriate because in today's sensibilities, some people or things don't want to be gendered, and they don't want to be called things. So using the word they might be appropriate, in which case I would say yes, because pragmatically that is the better way, or the way that the society has chosen to do it, even though it doesn't technically is not technically correct, but it doesn't technically make sense either, because a single person can't be referred to by a plural. Um, but nonetheless, we do it all of the time. So you can do things like that, but on the other hand, you don't want to go too exotic in your choice. So you should try to stay as technically correct as possible, saying only as close to pragmatics as possible without pushing the envelope. Let's say. And then finally, as our last slide here, talking about what makes language vivid. Vivid language is more recognizable than it is really to explain in a way, but vivid language can paint a picture in the mind's eye. It should be expressive enough that people can imagine what you're saying. So instead of calling something a toy truck, a more vivid way of saying that, it might be a red toy truck. And then an even more vivid way of saying that might be a cast iron red toy truck. And then finally, you might say a cast iron red fire engine toy truck. Each time, the picture that someone summons in their mind is going to be a little more clear, or a little more definite about what this object that I'm describing is. So vivid language gives a clear picture of what you're trying to describe in the mind of the person listening to you. Can you go through life saying things like, describing a story where you're watching a child play with a toy truck? Sure, but someone's going to imagine like a small blue plastic pickup, when really in your memory it's a red cast iron fire engine. So vivid language really decreases the ambiguity between what you mean and what images or what ideas are popping up in the other person's mind. So to do that, you want to describe how something looks. If it's relevant, describe how things taste, smell, how they feel, like in our example, what the material is made out of, because people have probably seen cast iron, people have seen plastic. They know that there's very different looks in the feel and the taste. Well, I mean, I suppose I've tasted plastic and cast iron back in my day when I was a youngin', so I know there's a big difference there. But they know that there's different. It helps them choose a better picture by knowing these things. So if it's relevant, describe how something tastes, what it's made out of, what something sounds like, how heavy it is. For example, I've had students describe like exotic pieces of like horse tacking equipment by comparing them to common items. So, for example, someone asked one of my students, how heavy is the horse saddle? and the person kind of didn't know, wasn't really expecting that kind of question, and I'm sure they knew what the pounds were, or at least somewhere in their brain that was. But what came out was it weighs about as much as you would think carrying 2 gallons of milk would weigh. And that was a great way to do it because at some point in our lives, almost everyone's probably carried 2 gallons of liquid, and kind of knows that it's kind of on one hand it's easy to carry, but at the same time it's heavy enough that you would probably want to take a rest if you're going to carry it over a huge distance. So, that was a great way to create an analogy that created a sensory experience based on some kind of shared experience that person was hoping that we had. You know what? We don't have time for a second video. So let's go ahead and move on then to the assignments for the week. And there's only 2 assignments. They shouldn't take you too horribly long, but they do involve some reading and writing, so let's go ahead and look at those now. The first assignment that I would like for you to do for the week, and again, these assignments are going to be due on Wednesday. Let's go ahead and write this down so I can copy and paste it later. Both surveys are due on Wednesday. What's that going to be? Wednesday, April 12th at 11:59 p.m. All right. But the first survey is the midterm communication apprehension survey. Actually, I should kind of look at that to make sure that's the right title. But let's go ahead and look at it. And I'll correct that document here in a second. It's just called Comm 210 Assessment Survey Midterm. So we're actually kind of behind on this, and it doesn't really reflect upon you; it reflects upon me. But we need to get some data for our Comm 210 assessment, and it's still we still got over a month left, or about a month left. So go ahead and take this survey. It is for the middle of the term. Most of the classes in person have done this about a week ago or a week and a half ago, and I simply forgot to tell you to do it. So let's go ahead and do that this week. So you need to take this survey. It's the same questions actually as this first survey here, but it's just a different survey to try to gauge how you are growing as the semester goes along, and then as we complete this speech and do the last speech in the week of finals, we'll do this end of semester assessment. But anyway, this one, the midterm, please do it this week within the next 7 days. Communication, the midterm communication assessment survey. All right. And the next one that you need to do, or the next thing that you need to do, is you need to create a survey on the topic of your persuasive speech that is between 6 to 10 questions long. Now we already talked a lot about surveys and how to create good, effective surveys. But I would like to kind of look at an example that my teaching assistant Liz did for you all. Here's Liz's example survey. So let's go ahead and pop that open for a second. Nope, that's the wrong one. There it is. Liz's persuasive speech survey example. Let's pop that open. And let's also disable our no script here. Okay, there we go. So this is not really different from your last speech, but it should try to reveal information or try to get information from the audience that better describes maybe how your audience feels about your topic. Because remember, persuasion is about convincing someone to do or believe something they do not already do or believe. So you can kind of assume maybe that there'll be some hostility towards that because people are sometimes resistant to change. So let's go ahead and look at some of these example questions here and talk about how Liz kind of addressed that. So she asked everybody, or she would ask everybody, did you vote in the 2016 midterm or presidential election? Now she's just seeing how active people are in, her topic is prison reform. So she's just trying to see how active people are in making their voices heard. And the reason why she was doing that is most likely because she wanted to see, first of all, whether or not you cared about the topic. And it's like, well, this is kind of a weird way to talk about that. But let's go ahead and look at question 2. If you did vote, then were you aware of where the candidates you voted for stand on prison reform? And so this sets us up for a situation where maybe you care a lot about you cared enough to vote, but maybe you didn't care about this particular issue, or maybe you didn't vote, but you did kind of understand where people were on this issue, and from those two ideas, you can kind of infer that maybe people didn't vote because of the way the candidates stood on prison reform. Perhaps in that exact scenario, like someone who didn't vote, but somebody who did know where candidates stood, kind of infer some information there. Similarly, if you voted in the midterm election and they said, yes, I know where they were the way they voted, you don't know how the audience member feels about prison reform just yet, but you do know that it might have been a factor in their decision making. In other words, it could have been something that they were paying attention to that did influence their choices. So these two questions appearing in sequence like that is a great way to infer some information about your audience and their attitude towards prison reform, even though this first one seems to have nothing to do with the topic at hand. And that's okay, as long as it kind of comes back around in a later question, or can give you insight into another question. And that's totally okay. So that's my rambly way of pointing out that sequence there, or how you can use that. How many people do you personally know who have been in prison? Maybe, again, to gauge your emotional investment in prison reform. If you have someone you know in prison, you're probably more invested in what's happening to them, or what will happen to them, or what isn't happening to them, than somebody who knows no one in prison. So again, this is a great way to assess whether or not you are invested in the topic. Now the next one is way more direct. What is your position on prison reform? 1 being against, 3 being you don't really care, and 5 being very supportive of prison reform. So she'll have you rank it here, and this is a direct way of assessing it. It also serves as a check for questions like these, because it could be that, let's say you know people who are in prison, but you're against prison reform. You can, again, infer information that maybe you just don't like who is in prison, but we still don't know what you think about prisons yet. Maybe you think prison is a great way to rehabilitate and that you're happy they're in prison because, they're going to get the help that they need. So this is where you have the writing questions, right, where you kind of get that ambiguous inferences that you have there. It's like, because here, there's 2 ways you can interpret, like, I have 3 people in prison, I'm against prison reform, right? You can interpret that meaning I hated those 3 people, I'm glad they're in the slammer, and I really think that they should be, in those cesspools. Or another way, like, I know 3 people in prison, I feel that they're great places to be because they rehabilitate people. I'm against prison reform because, to me, prison reform means getting rid of rehabilitation programs. So you don't really know that until you get to like a written question here. So what do you think are some positive aspects of the prison system? So if I wrote things like, I think it's really awesome that people get the help they need in prison, and then under number 6, when you think there are some negative aspects of the prison system, and the person writes, I know prison isn't the most fun place to be, but I don't really think there's a negative aspect to the whole institution. Right? This lets you know that the person is really on the idea that prisons are for rehabilitation, and they don't really find a problem wrong with it. Similarly, you might find something like, I think the prison system is so messed up that there's no way to change it or fix it. And then what do you think the negative aspects of the prison system? And then they go on for like 5 paragraphs. That tells you a lot about that particular person's attitude or reaction to whatever you're going to present. Now, at this point, it's not very clear what her thesis is about prison reform. She's just kind of asking questions that kind of get at the audience's attitude, trying to ask questions that get a sense of how invested people are in the topic in general. And in this way, the survey does really well. There's one thing, though, that I would definitely recommend. It says it's closed. Oh, no. The survey for the midterm is closed. Oh, rats. Okay, well, yeah, it's not a big deal. Um, it's not a big deal at all. We'll just make sure we do the midterm one. But in any case, thanks for that, Punky. I appreciate it. So I'll go ahead and address that in my announcement then. But in any case, there is one thing I would recommend that you do for these surveys, and one of them is go ahead and put your proposal. Remember, because each persuasive speech has a proposal in it. Go ahead and put your proposal in the question in a question and ask directly. Instead of saying what is your, you can ask what is your position on prison reform, but maybe towards the bottom you would say, what do you think of the idea of replacing prison sentences with mandatory drug counseling for people caught with marijuana? Right? It's a very specific question, but it'll actually help you understand more directly how your audience feels about the topic. But you do want to make sure you have enough questions to get some other inferences about their attitude before you ask the question that directly, because that can help you alter your speech. One of the things that we're going to do here is I'm going to give this survey not to you guys, unfortunately, but I'm going to have other people fill this out, and then next week we'll kind of talk about the results that we get from this survey and how you could use that to adapt your speech. And that sets us up for next week where you can do your outlines, and we'll start recording these things, because we won't have a heck of a lot of time after that. Thanks for your attention tonight. I really appreciate it. I know that's a stormy night. I've seen the viewer counter go up to like 12 and then back down to 3. I'm guessing that a lot of people are going to go without power. The lights have been flickering here as well. I'm kind of think it's a miracle I haven't lost connection yet. But thanks again for paying attention tonight. I really do appreciate it. So really, your only assignment, let's go ahead and bring this up before I really sign off, is to create a survey on the topic of your persuasive speech. Now, let's go ahead and fix this grammatically so that my perception, or that people perceive me the way I want to be perceived. Survey are due. Survey is due Wednesday, April 12th. Create a survey on the topic of your persuasive speech that is between 6 to 10 questions long, and I will want you to write your proposal as a direct question in some way to figure out how your audience feels or thinks, how your audience thinks about your specific topic. It could be, you could do any kind of question that involves your proposal. You could do a multiple choice question that involves it. You could do an open-ended question. You could do a 5-point rating scale like Liz did. There's the whole wide world of questions is open to you, but just make sure that your direct proposal figures somewhere into your survey. Okay. Are there any other questions? Again, towards the beginning of the broadcast, if you weren't there to see it, I did talk about that I did watch all of your informative speeches finally, and also graded all of your outlines for right and wrong. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and sleep on the results of the speeches. I'm going to look at the grade point average and all that for the speeches, and I'm going to see if I need to curve it. Maybe I shouldn't have admitted that, but actually, everybody did a fairly good job. But I just want to make sure that I didn't take off like 5 points for one person's mistake, and then another person made that same mistake, and I took off 8 points. That people that turned in similar quality work received similar quality grades. That's what I meant by curving it. Because sometimes, as you see grammatical mistakes, for example, appearing again and again, paper after paper, it's not the same person making the same mistake, but sometimes you just lose your darn mind, and you start grading it as if it was the same person making the same mistake, and so, the person at the bottom of the stack gets their butt kicked in terms of grade points, and then the other person that made it was the first person to make that mistake kind of skips out and gets Um, I can stop ranting about it. I'll post them tomorrow afternoon. You will have either a grade or a 0. If you have a 0, I guess first of all you need to contact me immediately because either that means I don't have your speech, and at this point, especially if you just plain old didn't do the work and turn it in, it's a very big problem for your grade point average in terms of passing the class. But I did try to contact people whose speeches I just could not find. And again, the email system could have ate it. That's fine, as long as you can give me, a file that has a timestamp on it that says you had it completed. I will grade it, on the spot or as close to on the spot as possible, and give you full credit. No big deal there for a technical malfunction. But in any case, if you get a 0, you need to contact me. And if you get a 0 and you don't contact me, then I really am at this point going to assume that you have dropped the course. So, in any case, that's where we are with that. So again, thanks for paying attention tonight. Do stay safe tonight. It's still rumbly and grumbly outside, and I'm sure it's windy and wet. So if you're going to travel, maybe consider not traveling if it's possible. But I hope that you are safe. And here is our assignment for the week. I will talk to you next Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. or via email before then. So thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and sign out.